Good morning. I'm Lina Delgado, Executive Director of the Colombian American Association. I would like to welcome everyone for what promises to be a great discussion between Maria Luisa Puig, Latin America Director at Eurasia Group, and former Ambassador of Colombia to the United States and the President of PROBOGOTA, Juan Carlos Pinzon, on how Colombia is facing the COVID-19 pandemic, its handling of the economic recovery, as well as the social and political challenges facing the nation. I would like also to introduce and welcome the moderator for today's program, Alejandro Rincon. Alejandro is an international journalist who serves as the New York correspondent of TNT 24, and he also works for one of the most important networks in Colombia, RCN. Alejandro covers stories with global impact, such as the 2016 and 2020 US presidential elections, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the work for the UN General Secretary. Thank you, Maria Luisa, Ambassador Juan Carlos Pinzon, and Alejandro for accepting our invitation to this program. Alejandro, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lina. Good morning to all. It's truly a pleasure to be with you this Wednesday morning. I'm honored by the opportunity given to me by the Colombian American Association on moderating this panel. First, allow me to introduce you to Maria Luisa Puig, Director in the Latin America practice at the Eurasia Group, where she leads political risk advisement for a group of countries, including Chile, Colombia, and Peru. Throughout her career, Maria Luisa has also worked with Oxford, Analytica, and Reuters. Maria Luisa, welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. Also joining today is Ambassador Juan Carlos Pinzon. He's the president of PROBOGOTA, a space for the discussion and promotion of strategic projects for the capital region of Colombia. Mr. Pinzon is also the former Colombian ambassador to the United States and Minister of Defense. Ambassador Pinzon, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Welcome.
Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you so much.
Now, a quick note on the rules of procedure for today. We will begin our dialogue with a brief introductory remarks by both of our panelists. We will have around 3 to 4 minutes for that. And then we will begin the rest of our discussion. Also, a very important note in the rules of procedure, we will have our Q&A section always open for all of you joining us today. We will be receiving all of these questions, and then in the last 15 minutes of our conversation, we'll be able, hopefully, to take as much questions as we can. So now, without further ado, Ambassador Pinzon, I would like to give you the floor first. So if you could please allow us to describe and to hear from you a general overview of today's economic and social environment in Colombia. What's the reality of the nation as to today, September the 16th?
Alejandro, thank you so much. And thank you to the Colombian American Association. It's a great pleasure to be here again. It's not my first time. You know, during my time as my tenure as ambassador, I spent, you know, several times with this wonderful organization, and I want to recognize their effort to, you know, bring Colombia to New York and to the United States, but at the same time trying to attract, you know, investors and a lot of interest from the United States to Colombia. Also, my regards to Maria Luisa. You know, I think Eurasia Group is one of the most structured and serious organizations analyzing the region and somehow the world politics and economics. So it's great to be here with you as well. And well, let me comment a little bit on Colombia to, as you said, give a little bit of framework. I will comment on COVID, you know, what has happened related to COVID, then the economy, you know, where are we and what are the prospects and what can be done. And finally, I would like to comment a little bit on the political environment, which always matters, especially in a country like Colombia, where, you know, things happen, as they said. So, you know, when I think about the COVID, let me just tell you that Colombia, as of now, unfortunately has already more than 23,000 people that has disease out of the COVID, which is a very big number, very sad. Every family is, you know, somehow hit by this. As of now, more than 730,000 people has been found as positive on PCR trials. On the relative side, I think Colombia has done better, if you can say this, in this very dramatic global pandemic than many other Latin American countries and even many other advanced countries. The number I will use is the number of deaths per million people. Number of deaths per million people, Colombia basically has, as of now, 467 deaths per million people, which is below Sweden, the United States, Spain, Italy, some other European countries, and definitely better than Mexico, Brazil, Peru, Chile, Ecuador, among many others. But of course, when you have 23,000 deaths, there's no way you can say this is a great thing. You have to be realistic. But looking to Colombian government, they have done two things that I believe are very relevant. The first, they doubled the number of ICUs in the country in a period of, I would say, 4 months. And of course, that has provided Colombia with better numbers in terms of saving lives than other countries. And second, there has been, as in many other countries, an economic effort that has implied around $7 billion, which is something like 3 to 4 points of GDP in emergency funds. Initially to support 2.6 million families that somehow were the poorest of the poor. I would describe them as that. And of course, those families are right now receiving a support package that's called Ingreso Solidario. I think that has been relevant and probably will need to continue to move forward. And on the other side, some funds, around 3.2 billion funds, and in addition to that, central bank, I would say, some expansionary monetary policy that has allowed first to keep the liquidity in the market, but at the same time to provide some lines of credit to SMEs specifically, and it has allowed to at least take this situation in a very reasonable way. Now, when you see the numbers, and let me jump into the economy, my second subject, let's be fair. We have right now the last number for the second quarter of 2020 was a contraction of GDP for minus 15.7%. That's the worst number ever. I think it's happening everywhere in the world. It's not Colombia, but this is the number Colombia had. And what has been problematic, especially in the city of Bogota, our capital city, where the lockdown has been useful in terms of saving lives, but at the same time, probably it overextended, and the consequence is that the city has been affected more than the country as a whole. So the number of contraction for the city of Bogota is expected to be even worse than the number I described for the country. What worries me the most is unemployment. Unemployment has basically doubled as of July. We reached a number of 20.1% for the country, which implies 4.6 million people without a job, unemployed. And when you think in unemployment for women, that number is 6 points above. So unemployment for women is 26%. And when you think about the young people, is the worst unemployment rate in the country, is 29%. And of course, when you combine that with some of the frustration, social unrest, the consequences that a pandemic brings in terms of even psychological misbehavior, if I can, underline this, and in some cases even intrafamily violence, among other diseases that come out of the lockdowns, is very worrisome, and it's something to be concerned, and it's a real challenge for Colombia. Now, let me give you a little bit of insight on how do I think the economy can be moved forward and what is being discussed. I want to tell you that I've been personally even part of a group of private sector leaders, entrepreneurs, the leaders of the main economic groups in the country, and a lot of economists, as I am, discussing on what can we propose to the government and how can we coordinate with national government for a recovery policy, and at the same time using this pandemic as an opportunity. And I think here's the positive. I think that Colombia historically has been able to find sound fiscal and macroprudent policies, which is positive. But second, historically, even on the worst of our times, by the end of 20th century, when we had violence to the peak and all these difficulties, we were able to coordinate between private sector and government. What do I see that comes? One, we're speaking on structural reforms, a pension reform, which might be required, a reform on, resources to provide more spending in education, to offer occupation to the youngsters, and to find digital opportunities for them. Thirdly, I believe it's important to discuss on a future tax reform. I don't think it's going to happen in the 2020, but probably in 2021. So it matters a lot to many Colombians not to lose the rating, the credit rating. And I think that's important, not to get a downgrade, and to continue to find a long-term policy. But at the same time, we understand that government is facing important fiscal deficit this year and next year. And that will imply for us that what matters is where that money is invested and how do we match funds between government, local governments, private sector institutional investors, and even people like the one is listening to us, international investors, that we want them to come to Colombia. We have identified some like 300 projects, from infrastructure to housing and even social infrastructure. Half of those projects are not requiring public funds. Maybe some subsidies in the housing side, maybe some investment in the infrastructure side, but also a lot of opportunities for urban renovation and other housing projects that can be done with private money. I think that if we can structure those projects, if we can give them some kind of a streamlined processes in terms of local permits or even environmental standards, I think if we can move on to that, the economy can create, more than, I would say, 2 to 3 million jobs in the next 24 to 36 months. Finally, on that regard, the idea of creating a fund for venture capital in digital economy, in somehow understanding that pandemia also brought to us a new thinking, a new technology, and the fourth industrial revolution, not anymore in a book, but now in our lives, as an example, this conference we're having, I think is a very big opportunity, and I think there's a lot of concern and perspective about that. Of course, the country requires more connectivity. The country will require strong efforts in the agribusiness industry, and all this is being discussed. I will end my remarks with politics and security, very briefly. Yes, the politics are getting more nasty in Colombia. Unfortunately, this is not Colombia, this is world democracy. When you see what is going on in Peru, when you see the United States elections being the most polarized ever, when you see what is going on in Spain, when you see what is going on in France, well, in Colombia, as a Western democracy, we're somehow having the same kind of debate and challenges. Of course, there are new things that are happening. Even today, there's a discussion on the potential freedom for President Uribe after being captured by request of the Supreme Court. Those things are new for Colombia, are not new for many other countries. But in Colombia, it was a new thing. And of course, we need to see how we move forward onto this. Second, the Havana agreements still are seen as a divisive force in this country. For some, is the opportunity for peace. For others, have been the consequence for the increase of drug trafficking, criminal mining, and of course, the reborn and rebirth of new terrorist activity and crime in certain regions of the country. And finally, social unrest, as we saw in Chile, we saw in many other regions and parts of Latin America, and definitely in the world, is happening in Colombia as well. I think that unrest can have a base on unemployment numbers and frustration numbers for the youngsters that I described. It implies policies dedicated to that sector. But on the other side, not to forget that in Colombia, still there are terrorist structures that have cells that can influence those social cases and somehow create some violence that unfortunately we saw last week. Hopefully, these are things that, as I said, are happening all around the region, definitely in the Western democracies, and we will have to foresee how to keep moving forward, seeking political agreements, political consensus, and somehow moving to the next phase. Finally, 2022 elections are going on. And what is strange these times is that usually they start a year before. And now I feel they are starting 2 years before. And when you're in election year, as is happening just right now in the United States, well, things become less rational and more passionate. And I think somehow what is the bad news this time is that this is happening ahead of time. With this, I tried to just paint an overview. Sorry for being long, but I thought it was necessary to just put at least the elements for discussion. Thank you, Alejandro.
Thank you, Ambassador Pinzon. Now, Maria Luisa, from your expertise, which do you consider are then the topics or that should gather attention in terms of the current political environment in Colombia? What do you see from all of these crises that's booming right now in the nation? What's your outline of the crisis there?
Great, thanks very much. So I would like to start, from a broad point of view, and also trying to see how Colombia fit in the context of Latin America, which was something that was briefly mentioned before, right? When we at Eurasia Group looked at the outlook for the region, and we were trying to reassess the outlook for the region after the pandemic first hit, we mentioned at that time that this is a region, Latin America, that is in general poorly positioned to manage a pandemic, right? To manage the coronavirus crisis, which is sort of like evident now, 6 months into the pandemic or a bit more. This is a region with high levels of informality, weak health systems, unlimited fiscal capacity, all of which is constraining the capacity of the different governments to mitigate the health and the economic challenges. And Latin America was already in quite a difficult political and economic situation before the pandemic erupted. So we are seeing how across the region, capacity of the different governments, for instance, to enforce the lockdowns, to provide economic relief is going down quite quickly, which points to a crisis that it's going to be extended. The response has been very different, but I'll guess that now it's pretty evident that even those countries that were seen as doing worse or doing better at the beginning of the pandemic, regardless, most of the countries of the region are struggling in terms of the number of cases per capita, the number of deaths per capita, the huge slump in economic activity, the spike in unemployment, and also very extended lockdowns that have created fatigue in among the citizens. So it is quite difficult to see how the post-pandemic outlook is going to look like. And a lot is going to depend on how the different countries, the different governments manage the health and the economic crisis. But I'll say that some trends are emerging, and some of them clearly apply to Colombia, right? One is higher taxes. So at some point, the governments will need some extra resources in order to pay for the bill. Two is elections in a context of very deep discontent. Discontent that was evident in protests in some countries in the region driven by a broad range of demands, and that have probably accentuated because of the healthcare and the economic emergency, and then how difficult it is going to be for countries across the region, for governments, for incumbents, to enact very difficult adjustments. So now, right, like how Colombia fits into this story? Well, the pandemic really hit Colombia at a time in which the president was facing low levels of support, lack of strong majorities in Congress. So he has had a sort of like he has never really had a very strong support from the ruling coalition or even from his own party, and also rising pressure from the streets. So Colombia did experience mass demonstrations that began towards the end of last year. They were not as big and as frequent as Chile, for instance, but they were quite significant for a country like Colombia. The pandemic erupted, prices of oil went down, and this obviously put significant stress on the economy, on fiscal accounts, and these challenges were probably exacerbated by the lack of structural reforms. We call that when President Duque first took office, when was this? In August 2018, he presented a tax reform initiative that was quite an ambitious bill. It included, for instance, extensions of the VAT to basic foodstuff, and at the end, the reform was diluted. The most controversial aspect of that reform was precisely the extension of the VAT that was removed. Well, the following year, the court struck down and another reform was passed. But the point is that it has proven difficult to enact unpopular changes in taxation and other reforms. I would say that similar to other countries in the region and in the world, the actions that President Duque took at the beginning of the pandemic to mitigate the spread of the virus helped his levels of support. So we saw how his approval ratings went up after he enacted mobility restrictions, even if the economic response of the pandemic has been limited by fiscal constraints. You have now the decision of the Fiscal Rule Committee to suspend the fiscal rule during 2020, during 2021, so until 2022, and that gives more space to the administration. So measures to mitigate the impact of coronavirus and to help economic recovery, so measures for households, for companies, will expand. But again, these are somewhat constrained in comparison with other countries in the region, Chile, for instance, because of the fiscal position of Colombia, the position where it was at the beginning of the pandemic. And I would say that in general, what we see is that President Duque's popularity probably going to decline, given the extent of the crisis, given the fact that the economy has collapsed, unemployment has grown. There is this fatigue with after an extended lockdown. So his approval ratings will probably continue going down. A risk of protest is also going to be significant. So we recently saw these renewed demonstrations that were triggered by the death of this man in police custody, and probably this anger aggravated by the fact that there was this horrible video circulating in social media. But I would say that in that respect, there was this trigger and there was clearly anger over police actions, but the demonstration showed more deep factors, right? It showed discontent that is quite significant, that was evident in the demonstrations that erupted last year, and that has not really disappeared, right? It has just been on hold because of the pandemic, because people do not take to the streets as much, particularly at the beginning of this pandemic, because of fears of infection, because of mobility restrictions. But we can expect that the risk of protest is going to be significant. And then I would say, well, like, what does this really mean for policy and for any type of reform going forward? And I would say that the fact that it is likely for the government to keep a low political capital and for social dynamics to remain fragile, this is going to constrain the willingness and the capacity of the president and the political class as a whole to pass unpopular measures that are needed or that are seen to be needed after the pandemic, right? So for instance, a tax reform that contains unpopular elements to boost revenue and therefore for the fiscal deficit to fall within the parameters of the fiscal rule from 2022 onwards, or a structural pension reform that is something that has been under discussion in Colombia for a while. So these reforms were already looking difficult. Well, they probably look even more difficult now, given the pandemic, given the limited political capital of the administration, the fragile social dynamics, and also that the political class that will be in charge of passing these measures is likely going to be discussing these measures well, that will be next year, so very close to the next election cycle, right? Colombia is going to have congressional elections in March 2022, presidential elections in May. So it's a challenging political, social, and policy outlook. But I would say that has a lot in common with the challenges that we are seeing in other countries in the region, right? So when I was talking about Latin America and the trends that were emerging, I mentioned the need for higher taxes or for measures to boost revenue, which indeed applies to this case. The elections that are going to take place in a context of deep discontent, because of demands that were evident in last year's demonstrations, but also because of discontent that is tied to the fallout from the pandemic. And then finally, how this is going to make it very difficult for Colombia and for other countries in the region to enact difficult adjustments. So not a very nice outlook. We're in the middle of the pandemic, but again, I think that many of the social, political, and policy challenges that Colombia is facing at the moment have a lot in common with what we are seeing in other countries in Latin America and more broadly.
All right, thank you, Maria. Ambassador Pinzon, back to elegant from the remarks, in which you mentioned how, for example, Colombia has had a huge contraction of its GDP. It's pretty much the worst that we have seen throughout the world. So looking forward to the future and how you can create a strategy to help Colombia rebuild and rebuild for the better. How do you see, for example, the role of the private sector into contributing to rebuilding an economy and generating employment in the nation, basically, now also that there's possibilities of having additional investments in the nation? And could you, for example, give us one idea into the role of private sector in rebuilding the economy and overall how to deal with this deep crisis in terms of the economy that Colombia is facing right now due to the pandemic?
Well, the first thing that we need to understand is that this is a world crisis. This is not a Colombian crisis. This is happening everywhere. And there are countries that are more affected, not only in terms of COVID consequences, but also in terms of economics. There are countries that are expected even to contract more than Colombia, and actually is happening. Second, I will never underestimate the resilience of Colombia, as has been proven in the past 2 decades. While in many countries that face even crises less deep than the one we faced by the end of the 20th century and beginning of this century. In many cases, private leaders left the country. In many cases, somehow, the situation broke apart, and the consequences were dramatic for countries. In Colombia, when we had those very terrible circumstances, we were able to find consensus. First of all, the consensus of security that somehow, create a different reality for Colombia, decreasing violence and all types of crime, to the lowest levels in 4 decades as we speak now. And I think that was important, and that is something substantial. But to connect with your view, I think that private sector has been very much very relevant on all this. First, because they didn't leave the country when things were difficult. They continue to invest and they continue to develop their businesses in spite of these terrible scenarios. So now when I put myself in today's world, in this 2020, in a world pandemic, well, I think that this conversation that among private sectors leaders is happening to promote and to propose to government ideas for reforms, and at the same time, ideas for specific investment projects that can allow the creation of jobs and the creation of opportunities and the recovery of the economy, prove somehow how we can try to work, public-private coordination in order to regain momentum. I'm not saying this is going to be easy, and I'm not saying this is going to just happen out of the blue, but I'm saying here, this discussion is happening as we speak, and I think we will find some space. Of course, the obsession in these years to come in a country like Colombia, I guess worldwide, but definitely in a country like Colombia, considering what Maria Luisa and I described on social unrest and what I explained very well about unemployment number for the youngsters, implies a very strong commitment for creation of jobs, opportunities specifically for that targeting the population, and at the same time, strengthening the education for jobs. There's a big discussion all around the world about education. A lot of people said, what do you need for a solution in society? Education. Well, it's true, but education for what? And what matters very much is connecting this education with sources of income. It implies jobs and entrepreneurial opportunities. Final comment on something that I heard from Maria Luisa about the current political environment. Not to forget that in the past month, Congress elected the national prosecutor or the national inspector. The Congress elected also a new member for the Constitutional Court, our highest court, and the Congress also elected, someone that we will describe as the ombudsman of the nation. These three are very senior positions, and the majorities were gained by the government majority. So being fair with President Duque, which of course is not as strong as other presidents in the past, as has been described in terms of his potential of putting reforms ahead, we have to see the facts. And the recent facts show that he was able to put a majority, and on these 3 occasions, his majority was able to elect the person that he would prefer, proving that there's a possibility still of creating majorities in Colombia for future reforms, pension reform, and definitely a tax reform by the second half of 2021.
Now, Maria Luisa, I would really like to follow up precisely on this last element that Ambassador Pinzon was mentioning, and it is the capacity of creating consensus in Colombia, which was precisely something that you mentioned as an element that created added uncertainty in terms of the political outlook in Colombia. So I wonder whether or not would you agree with this position by Ambassador Pinzon, and this thing of creating consensus in Colombia to be able to move forward, is this one of the major leading roles that the Colombian government should take on moving forward to try to improve its political outlook for the future? How do you see that?
Yes, thank you. What I would say is that basically the capacity of the government and the willingness of the government and the political class to reach consensus over topics that could be unpopular in nature is going to be more difficult or more constrained as a result of the pandemic, as a result of the potential decline in levels of popularity, how fragile are dynamics in the streets, and that is going to become even more complicated as the congressional and presidential elections approach. So does that mean that there are not going to be any reforms approved next year? No, I don't think so, right? Like, so for instance, at some point they will probably need to pass a tax reform by the end of 2021 in order for it to take effect from 2022. The contents of that reform and how much it can boost revenue, then that's a matter for discussion. And I think that it's part precisely of that discussion where these difficulties in reaching agreement will be accentuated by upcoming elections, by the huge economic contraction that we're going to see this year, and the fact that people are angry or are angry with the economic situation, that it's not happening in Colombia but in the whole world, but less willing to endure this sort of like a more painful adjustment, right? It is more about the contents or what is under discussion.
Now, economic situation, I would like to other of the elements that works, and it is part of the plans or strategies that may come into fruition in Colombia moving forward. In particular, you mentioned how, for example, we need there in Colombia to create a fund to be able to advance in the post-pandemic recovery. Do you see any other idea or example that we could bring into fruition in Colombia? Because after all, part of the uncertainty that we have, not only in Colombia, but also being part of the international community, is what's the plan? What do we do now that we're navigating this so unexpected territory? So what do we do? Any ideas on how this fund can actually become a reality, and what other ideas do you believe that we could implement in Colombia moving forward?
There's the need of a national recovery plan, and that's the way this has been framed as we discussed. And the National Recovery Plan, as I said, requires national government funds that still come from the emergency fund, especially for the social activities, those families that are in need. Second, investment funds coming out of the fiscal funds that, of course, are affected, but still, debt continues to be a source of funding. From local governments, there are a lot of investments still in the local plans from a city like Bogota, Medellin, Barranquilla, that will be relevant for this. And definitely, we're trying to focus on institutional investors, local institutional investors, by establishing certain kind of projects in which they can invest. I don't have any doubt that international funds that are seeking for where to put their liquidity that is abundant right now worldwide, and that is seeking for better rates, will come to countries like Colombia. Colombia historically has been attractive to many of these investors, especially in the United States and Europe, mainly because the tradition of never defaulted, the tradition of macroprudence fiscal policies, and somehow that has created some credibility vis-a-vis history for Colombia. Now, what matters is what projects. Where do we put these ideas out of this plan? And the ideas are mainly focusing on infrastructure for competitiveness, which matter very much. Colombia, even before the pandemics and even after the pandemics, will continue to have a challenge to enhance its productivity, especially the logistics of our infrastructure. That implies ports, some airports, and definitely enhancing the quality of roads to lower cost. Second, housing. Not to forget, Colombia has 3 million families without a house or living in a very low conditions. And that is a huge opportunity because, of course, government has been providing certain kind of subsidies for housing. But if you match funds and establish financial closures between government subsidies and financial sources, definitely you can create a social impact, but at the same time, move forward the whole economic value chain that is related to housing. Thirdly, agribusiness. Colombia has a huge potential on agribusiness, but the fact is that we have a very low industrialized agriculture system. The big opportunity right now is first to provide what we call tertiary roads. The government has put, even in the budget for 2021, something like, I would say $500 million or 1.5 billion pesos, which is a relevant money for tertiary roads, especially in isolated areas of the country, even that can contribute to confront illegal crops. That's even a positive, because if you allow the local farmers to move out their projects, their products, that's very, very important. But second, we will have to find out of the pandemic, how to strengthen certain industries that can create value added into some of our agricultural products. I think that's an important discussion also ongoing. Fourthly, I would say connectivity and digital economy. Pandemic all around the world, but definitely in middle-income countries like Colombia, has proven somehow part of the social divide, the inequality between those who have access, like people that is connected right now, like us, on these kind of systems that can do some kind of teleworking, that can even be creative and make use of technology to provide income, and even to spend time at home for education. That is not the truth for a very important number of people in a country like Colombia. So we will have to discuss if we make connectivity a public, basically a public right, if you put it in perspective. And that is something that has been under discussion and needs to be seen. How do you do this with the providers, the technology providers, and of course, the government? Then you have to make an effort, as I described before, on education. Education for having income. Education for the next economy, for the digital economy. And this is a very relevant reform and challenge that we have in the year to come. So I think this is all being discussed. And the new thing is this idea of trying to create a joint fund between public funds and private funds that can do some venture activity in this new kind of economy. That will be a very strong statement. Of course, this is a vision, this is a plan. We need to figure out how to create a consensus around this. But I think that discussion is going on different levels. Of course, I would be in agreement with Maria Luisa with the idea of elections in the year 2022. And I said during my first comments, my initial remarks, that unfortunately elections this time started not 1 year before, but 2 years ahead.
Yeah.
And of course, that's challenging, and it makes agreement and consensus more difficult. But I think majorities in Congress can be created. A consensus between private sector and government can be at least created. And I think more important than all, this is not in the interest of one sector, of one party. We're in the middle of the worst ever crisis that is known in history of economics of Colombia, but I would say everywhere.
Yeah.
And this is an opportunity to really lead, to really have this kind of conversation and to find ways to move forward. And I'm hopeful, although I'm realistic too. I know that the threats coming out of the crime in Colombia, of the frustration that is there, of very responsible populist politicians that are out there too, is very risky. Some misconsequences coming out of the Havana Agreement also are there, but we can overcome this. We have overcome even worse situations in terms of existential reality for Colombia. I remember by the year 2000, 1999, 2001, Colombia was, you know, a fractured country, a country that was expected not to be even a single nation. It was a failed state, according to many. And we were able to overcome that. And in a period of 15, 20 years, we reach a point of progress. Pandemia comes, of course, it brings poverty, it brings unemployment, but now we have an opportunity to, you know, touch down and, you know, pick up again.
All right, thank you, Ambassador. And finally, before moving to the open Q&A question, Maria Luisa, I would just like very quickly to follow up on you on the role of social unrest for the current political climate in Colombia. Is there any element in particular that you would like to highlight into how social unrest could either still be creating problems in Colombia, and how do you see the role of this latest wave of social unrest in the nation as having a major role in the definition of the future political climate in the nation?
Yeah, sorry, I was in mute. I think that it's not only in the case of Colombia, right? That it's a good reminder of what will probably be among the main challenges for this administration and for other administrations across the region, which is to make sure that they are tackling social discontent, which is driven by a broad range of issues specific to each country, but probably that includes but is not limited to more and better public spending, among many other issues, while at the same time making sure that they push for favorable investment conditions, that they help economic activity, right, economic recovery, and that they eventually pass reforms that are needed or that are necessary for adjustment in a much more difficult environment precisely because of the social dynamics and the electoral calendar. So it's at the end to balance all of this, right? To tackle discontent, one, to ensure economic growth, two, to pass reforms that ensure adjustment in this very complicated environment.
All right, thank you. Now we're going to move on to open our session. We will begin with Nicolás Garcia. And then just a quick reminder that as soon as both Maria Luisa or Ambassador Pinzon, anytime you want to weigh in, you're free to do so. We're having first a question on something that definitely has to do with all of the reality that we're living in Colombia, and it's got to do with the influence of the crisis of migrants and refugees from Venezuela. So overall, Nicolás wants to ask your insight on what should be Colombia's policy towards this wave of migration, and how much of a role do you see this crisis having a role in internal politics and economy and the overall outlook for the country? Maria Luisa, maybe you want to begin?
Yes, I mean, we don't give policy recommendations. What I would say is that this has clearly been a great issue for Colombia for a long time now, which apart from, like from the social specific perspective, it created significant pressure on the fiscal as well because of spending, and that was actually one of the reasons why the Fiscal Rule Committee relaxed deficit targets some years ago. But it's also an opportunity for growth, right? It's an opportunity for greater consumption, for greater economic growth in the future. I mean, with respect to the specific stance, I think that Colombia has been probably that country or one of the countries with the most outspoken position of trying to seek regime change in Venezuela, but at the same time, it is clear that the capacity of the government for this to resolve is quite limited, right? It's quite constrained, and it has also been very evident from the beginning that there were limits, or that Colombia wouldn't be in a position, for instance, to support some sort of like military intervention. I don't think that this is going to change. So it's basically how to weather this very challenging migration situation now in an even more difficult position, which is the coronavirus crisis.
Now, Ambassador, do you believe that policy in any way should be adjusted in Colombia to think of a possibility of including Venezuelan migrants and refugees as part of this strategy? Do you believe that there is any idea or role that this should be taken into account?
Alejandro, Venezuela's Maduro's regime is a real nightmare for Colombia. It's very problematic for us. On one hand, they support and promote terrorist organizations that have acted against Colombian people and Colombian national interests. Second, they allow in their territory criminal businesses like drug trafficking and illegal mining. But not only that, before they did it for, I would say, purposes of ideological identity. Now they do it for the purpose of business, to sustain the regime with drugs and with illegal gold and illegal coltan extracted even in Colombian territory. Then the permanent violation of human rights, the destruction of democracy and institutions in Venezuela have implied that millions of Venezuelans have fled. And almost half of those Venezuelans that have fled, the 4 million Venezuelans that have left the country, are inside Colombian territory. Colombian democracy have shown, I would say, the level of values that we are supposed to have. Being open for taking care of those Venezuelans, brothers and sisters in need. And it has implied policies that many countries have supported in order to take care of these immigrants. But let's face it, even before the pandemic, that was a challenge in fiscal terms, in social terms, in security terms. Now, the pandemic, of course, irritates this and make this situation very dramatic. We always have seen the positive side, which is, okay, a lot of Venezuelans came. That has implied labor force, young labor force, sometimes even qualified labor force that has somehow contributed to Colombian economy and to productivity. And that's the positive of all this. The hard side is that when you have 20% of unemployment, and in addition to that, you have still people coming from abroad, it is quite challenging. And on this, I believe Colombia will need to continue to request international support. I think UN needs to continue to support, and I expect other nations to continue to support, because this is about a humanitarian aid and crisis, people in need, people that is not here because they like it, people that is here because they don't have any other chance, and maybe if they stay in their own country, they might get killed by their own regime. So this is very important to see it as a concept that is not a Colombian problem.
Yes.
This is a Latin American problem, an international problem that requires an international response.
Ambassador Pinzon, I want to stay with you. We have a question coming from Juan Castellanos, and it's got to do with quote unquote, very strict business regulations in Colombia. And he wants to know whether or not you have any ideas on how you could work with the government to be able to bring more investment into dealing better negotiations, into having better regulations that are not so strict in the country. Any ideas on how would you work in this matter to incentivize investment in Colombia? And we're just like super close to the end. So if you could give us a broad idea on this.
Well, there has been a recent conversation that has renewed again, considering the unemployment rate and especially the youngsters' unemployment, about a labor reform. How do we make the labor market more flexible and less complicated? that is not an easy solution. And I will put myself on Maria Luisa's thoughts, trying to flexibilize the labor market in the middle of unemployment should be the right thing to do, but it's the most difficult time to try, you know, because of course there's frustration and it's not easy to move forward. But that conversation is going on, and I think there are some signals on that. The other two things that have become very difficult in Colombia, being very transparent, is environmental safeguards. This is happening everywhere, but definitely in Colombia are becoming very difficult for extracting businesses, even those that are doing this kind of businesses with very high standards. And what some people describe as social safeguards, the consultations to populations in certain areas. Because of course, those communities deserve to get benefits out of investment, but sometimes are manipulated by political interest and even criminal interest that makes these communities get into a very difficult position, being pressured. We need to work onto that. There's a law that is being discussed also and is part of this set of private sector ideas that contains a package that includes a review on the social safeguards policies in order to make these a little more streamlined and more effective. Finally, as part of what has been recommended to the government, we have told them that on those almost 300 projects, investment projects that I described, from public infrastructure to urban renovation all around the country, we are telling them that they need to create inside the presidential palace, among the presidential advisors, the clear responsibility to make a streamlined process for all these projects, so investment can flow faster and the projects can really create its purpose in terms of jobs and progress.
All right, thank you so much, Ambassador. And with that, we end our section of Q&A. And now, Lina, the floor is yours.
Lina's with the mic off.
You're in mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, Maria Luisa, and thank you, Ambassador Juan Carlos Pinzon, for this great discussion and for giving us the new insights into the outlook for Colombia. I also want to thank our team for making this event possible, and thank you for all participants. We will look forward to meeting with you again soon. Thank you so much, and thank you, and have a nice day.
Bye.
Thank you, Lina, and thank you,
very much.
Lisa. Thank you, Alejandro. And thank you all that were connected here. Appreciate your presence. Thank you so much.
Thanks, bye.